You've changed, and now everything around you feels different. Have you ever walked into a room you've been in 100 times, and suddenly it feels unfamiliar? Not because the furniture moved, not because anything dramatic happened, but because something inside you shifted. The conversations don't land the same. The jokes don't hit the same. Even the silence feels different, and you can't quite explain it. It's not that the world transformed overnight. It's that you did. There comes a moment in personal growth when the external world starts to feel slightly out of sync with your internal world. You're still in the same city, around the same people, doing many of the same routines, but your perception has matured. Your tolerance has changed. Your awareness has sharpened. And that shift can feel disorienting. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, just different. If you've been feeling that lately, like you're walking through familiar spaces with unfamiliar eyes, this isn't about fate. It isn't about destiny. It's about psychological evolution. And growth has side effects no one talks about. When you outgrow the version of you that fit in, there was a time when blending in felt natural. You laughed at things you didn't find funny. You tolerated dynamics that drained you. You said yes because saying no felt uncomfortable. And it worked. You had connection, you had rhythm, you had a place. But growth changes your nervous system. It recalibrates your standards. It redefines what feels aligned and what feels forced. Now, the same interactions that once felt normal feel exhausting. It's not that you dislike people. It's that you can sense the subtle misalignment. The conversations skim the surface when you're craving depth. The energy feels rushed when you're leaning toward intention. This is one of the quietest but most profound parts of transformation. You don't just change your goals, you change what feels acceptable. And when that happens, everything around you starts to feel different, not because it worsened, but because your threshold evolved. That evolution can create loneliness, not because you're isolated, but because you're in transition. And transitions are rarely comfortable. The space between who you were and who you're becoming. There's a strange in-between phase in growth that people rarely describe accurately. You're no longer who you used to be, but you're not fully who you're becoming either. You're shedding habits, releasing old reactions, catching yourself before repeating patterns. But the new identity isn't fully solid yet. It's like renovating a house while still living inside it. There's dust in the air, furniture moved out of place, walls half finished. From the outside, nothing looks drastically different, but internally, everything is under reconstruction. During this phase, the world can feel unstable, not because it's unstable, but because your internal compass is recalibrating. You begin noticing dynamics you once ignored. You recognize emotional patterns you used to participate in. You feel conversations more deeply. And awareness can make things temporarily uncomfortable. Because once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. Growth doesn't make you superior. It makes you responsible. Responsible for your boundaries. Responsible for your energy. Responsible for how you show up. And responsibility changes how everything feels. Why familiar environments suddenly feel off. Have you noticed how certain places don't feel the same anymore? The cafe you used to love feels loud. The group chat feels draining. Even scrolling through content feels heavier. It's not random. When your internal values shift, your sensory experience shifts with it. Your brain becomes more selective about stimulation. Your tolerance for chaos decreases. Your appetite for meaningful interaction increases. This isn't about becoming antisocial. It's about becoming intentional. As you mature emotionally, your nervous system starts prioritizing calm over chaos, depth over distraction, authenticity over performance. That shift creates friction in environments built on noise. And sometimes, instead of blaming the environment, we blame ourselves. We think, why am I so sensitive now? Why can't I just enjoy things the way I used to? But growth often feels like loss before it feels like gain. You lose tolerance for misalignment. You lose interest in shallow validation. You lose the urge to prove yourself. And while that loss creates space for something better, the space itself can feel empty at first. Different doesn't always mean wrong. Sometimes it means upgraded awareness, the quiet grief of outgrowing people. One of the hardest parts of changing internally is recognizing when certain relationships were built around older versions of you. Shared humor, shared struggle, shared coping mechanisms. When you evolve, the foundation shifts. It doesn't mean the other person is bad. It doesn't mean you're better. It simply means the dynamic was designed for who you were, not who you're becoming. And that realization can hurt, because you're not just losing comfort, you're losing familiarity. You might still care deeply about people, and yet feel an invisible distance growing. Conversations become shorter. Silences become longer. Effort feels heavier. Growth sometimes reduces compatibility. Not out of judgment, but out of divergence. Paths split quietly, not with drama, not with betrayal, just with subtle drift. And that drift can make everything around you feel different, because your emotional anchors are shifting. This is where many people panic. They try to shrink back into their old identity just to preserve connection. But forced regression creates internal conflict. And internal conflict is louder than loneliness. When your standards rise without you announcing it. You didn't wake up one morning declaring new standards. They developed slowly. You began valuing honesty more than harmony, peace more than popularity, depth more than attention. You stopped reacting as quickly. You paused before engaging. You started choosing silence over argument. And because you didn't make a public announcement about this internal shift, people around you may not immediately understand the change. They might say you've become distant, serious, different, and they're right. But different doesn't mean disconnected. It means deliberate. When your standards rise internally, the world around you can feel smaller, not because it is smaller, but because you no longer fit into spaces that require you to shrink. That realization can feel isolating at first. But isolation during growth isn't punishment. It's integration. You're integrating a stronger sense of self. And integration takes quiet. There's a subtle strength in feeling out of place. Feeling slightly out of place can feel uncomfortable, but it's often a sign of expansion. When you stretch mentally and emotionally, your old environments can feel tight, like wearing clothes you've outgrown. They still technically fit, but they restrict your movement. Instead of seeing this discomfort as rejection, consider that it might be evidence of development. You're noticing more, feeling more, reflecting more. You're no longer operating on autopilot. And that awareness changes how everything around you feels. Not because life became hostile, but because you became conscious. If this resonates with you, take a moment and really sit with it. Where in your life have things started to feel different? Is it your friendships, your work, your daily routines, your internal dialogue? Growth doesn't usually arrive with fireworks. It arrives with subtle shifts in perception. And when perception changes, the entire world seems to change with it. But the truth is simpler. You changed, and the world is simply reflecting that back to you. When growth makes you more aware of energy. One of the first subtle changes people notice during deep personal growth is a heightened sensitivity to energy. not in a mystical sense, in a psychological one. You begin noticing tone shifts in conversations. You sense when someone is speaking from insecurity instead of confidence. You feel when a space is tense, even if no one is openly arguing. Before, you may have brushed these signals aside. You might have adapted quickly, matched the mood, or distracted yourself. Now you pause. You observe. You feel the undercurrent. This doesn't mean you've become fragile. It means your awareness expanded. Your nervous system isn't numb the way it used to be. You're no longer constantly overriding your intuition just to maintain comfort. And once that awareness sharpens, environments that once felt neutral can suddenly feel overwhelming. Loud personalities feel louder. Passive-aggressive comments feel heavier. Small talk feels thinner. The difference isn't the volume of the world. It's the clarity of your perception. That clarity can feel isolating at first because you're processing layers most people don't slow down enough to examine. But it's also a sign that you're no longer operating unconsciously. You're choosing presence over autopilot. And presence changes everything when you stop performing and start being. There's a subtle performance most people don't realize they're putting on. It's the version of themselves designed to be liked, to be accepted, to avoid conflict. For years, you may have adjusted your tone, softened your opinions, exaggerated your reactions, or laughed a little louder than you felt. It wasn't fake, it was adaptive. We all adapt to survive socially. But at some point, performing becomes exhausting. You start noticing how drained you feel after certain interactions. Not because the people are terrible, but because you weren't fully yourself in the room. As you grow, that tolerance for performance decreases. You don't want to exaggerate excitement you don't feel. You don't want to nod along with perspectives that contradict your values. You don't want to explain yourself endlessly just to avoid being misunderstood. You start valuing authenticity over approval. And that shift can make social spaces feel unfamiliar. Because when you stop performing, you also stop controlling how others perceive you. Some will appreciate the grounded version of you. Others will feel unsettled by it. Not because you changed into something extreme, but because you stopped mirroring what they expected. That's when everything around you starts to feel different. The feedback changes, the dynamics shift, the invitations slow down or transform. But what you gain is something steadier. You gain alignment, the internal silence that replaces external noise. Another shift that often goes unnoticed at first is your relationship with noise. Not just literal noise, mental noise. You may find yourself craving more quiet, more space without constant stimulation, more time where you're not reacting to notifications, conversations, opinions, and endless commentary. This isn't withdrawal. It's recalibration. When your identity begins solidifying, you need space to hear your own thoughts clearly. Growth requires integration time, reflection time, unfiltered mental processing. And if your life was previously built around distraction, the silence can feel uncomfortable. You might reach for your phone instinctively. You might feel restless in stillness. You might mistake calm for boredom. But over time, that silence becomes nourishing. You start recognizing how much clarity lives in quiet moments. You realize that many of your previous reactions were just echoes of external pressure. Without constant input, you begin hearing your authentic voice more clearly. And once you experience that internal steadiness, chaotic environments feel less appealing. Not because you're above them, but because they disrupt something you worked hard to build. That internal quiet becomes a new baseline, and anything that disturbs it feels noticeably different. When you become more selective with your energy, there's a moment in personal evolution where your energy starts to feel valuable. Before, you may have given it freely. Time, attention, emotional labor. You showed up for everyone. You answered every call. You engaged in every debate. Now you pause before investing. Not from coldness, from awareness. You understand that attention is a currency, and you can't spend it everywhere without draining yourself. This selectiveness can confuse people. They might interpret it as distance or assume something is wrong. But nothing is wrong. You're simply realizing that your emotional bandwidth isn't unlimited. You've experienced what it feels like to be depleted. You've felt the exhaustion of overextending. You've learned what happens when you ignore your own limits. So now you protect your time more carefully. You say no more calmly. You disengage from arguments faster. You choose depth over volume. And that selectiveness shifts your environment. Some relationships strengthen because they're built on mutual respect. Others fade because they depended on your constant availability. Either way, the landscape changes, and you begin to understand that growth isn't just about adding new things. It's about refining what remains. When your emotional reactions slow down, one of the clearest indicators that you've changed is how you respond to situations that once triggered you instantly. Maybe criticism used to feel like an attack. Maybe silence used to feel like rejection. Maybe disagreement used to feel like disrespect. Now there's space between stimulus and response. You feel the initial reaction rise, but you don't immediately act on it. You observe it. You question it. You choose your response instead of being controlled by it. That space is maturity. And when you start responding instead of reacting, people notice. Arguments don't escalate the same way. Drama doesn't hook you as easily. Provocation loses its power. Sometimes others will even try harder to get a reaction because your calm feels unfamiliar to them. But you're not disengaged. You're grounded. This grounded presence can make previous environments feel out of sync. Dynamics that thrived on intensity no longer have the same pull. You're no longer feeding chaos. You're conserving peace. And peace changes the texture of your reality. The subtle shift in what you find impressive. There was a time when certain things captivated you. Status, attention, loud confidence, fast success. But growth has a way of recalibrating what you admire. You start noticing substance over spectacle, consistency over flash, integrity over image. The people you once thought were intimidating now seem insecure. The lifestyles that once seemed glamorous now look exhausting. This isn't judgment. It's perspective. You've seen behind the curtain enough times to recognize that not everything that shines is stable. And when your values deepen, your admiration shifts accordingly. This shift can make social circles feel different. Conversations centered on comparison and competition may feel hollow. You might crave discussions about meaning, purpose, self-awareness, and growth instead of surface-level metrics. And when those conversations are rare, the environment can feel isolating. But isolation in this context isn't emptiness. It's clarity. You're no longer distracted by illusions that once consumed your attention. When your identity stops being negotiable. Earlier in life, identity can feel flexible in an unhealthy way. You adjust depending on who you're around. You shift opinions to maintain harmony. You compromise values to avoid discomfort. But growth solidifies identity. You know what you believe. You know what you won't tolerate. You know what aligns and what doesn't. And that clarity makes negotiation less frequent. Not because you're rigid, but because you're rooted. Rooted people don't sway with every breeze. They listen, they consider, but they don't abandon themselves to be accepted. When identity becomes stable, Environments that require constant compromise start feeling restrictive. You might notice you speak less in certain rooms, not from insecurity but from discernment. You choose your words carefully. You don't feel the need to fill every silence. That restraint is strength, and strength changes how people interact with you. Some lean in, others step back, but either way, the dynamic shifts. And once again, everything around you feels different, not because the world changed overnight, but because your foundation did, when you start seeing patterns instead of incidents. Another shift that makes the world feel different is your ability to recognize patterns. Before, you may have experienced situations as isolated moments, an argument here, a misunderstanding there, a disappointment that seemed random. Now you see the thread connecting them. You notice how certain behaviors repeat, how certain environments produce the same emotional outcome, how certain dynamics drain you in predictable ways. This awareness isn't about blaming others. It's about recognizing cycles. And once you see the pattern, it becomes harder to participate in it unconsciously. You start stepping back mid-conversation and thinking, I've seen this before. You start noticing when someone is projecting their insecurity instead of communicating clearly. You catch yourself before falling into the same emotional trap. That clarity can feel empowering, but it can also feel disorienting. Because when you stop playing your role in old patterns, the script changes. People who were used to a certain reaction from you don't get it anymore. Situations that once escalated now dissolve because you refuse to fuel them. The absence of familiar chaos can feel strange at first. Calm can feel unfamiliar if intensity was once your normal. But this shift is a sign that you're no longer living on repeat. You're interrupting cycles instead of reinforcing them. And that interruption makes everything around you feel different. When you become comfortable with being misunderstood, there was likely a time when being misunderstood felt unbearable. You wanted to clarify everything. You wanted to correct every assumption. You felt compelled to explain your motives until others approved of them. Growth changes that, not because you stop caring about people, but because you stop needing universal agreement. You realize that not everyone has the same lens, the same experiences, or the same emotional maturity. And trying to control how everyone interprets you is exhausting. So you start choosing your peace over endless explanation. If someone misunderstands you once, you clarify calmly. If they persist in misunderstanding you, you step back. That decision alone shifts your entire social landscape. Some relationships strengthen because they're built on genuine curiosity and respect. Others weaken because they depended on constant validation. Being comfortable with misunderstanding is not arrogance, it's emotional independence. And emotional independence changes how the world responds to you. People can sense when you're no longer seeking approval. And that subtle shift can make familiar dynamics feel unfamiliar. When you realize growth is always loud, there's a misconception that transformation is dramatic. That growth looks like quitting everything overnight, making bold declarations, reinventing your entire life in one sweeping move. But real growth is often quiet. It's choosing not to engage in gossip. It's walking away from an argument without announcing your maturity. It's changing your morning routine without posting about it. These small, consistent shifts accumulate, and over time, they create a completely different internal experience. You might look around one day and realize you don't crave the same validation. You don't chase the same attention. You don't feel pulled toward the same distractions. From the outside, your life may look similar. From the inside, it feels transformed. And because the transformation is internal, it can feel invisible. Others may not recognize how much work you've done. They may not see the boundaries you've strengthened or the habits you've broken. But you know, and that quiet confidence becomes its own anchor. You don't need applause for evolution. You feel it in your nervous system. You feel it in your restraint. You feel it in the way you sleep at night. That internal shift makes the external world feel slightly out of sync, because you're no longer driven by the same motivations. When solitude starts feeling productive instead of lonely, there's a stage in personal development where solitude transforms. At first, being alone might have felt like rejection, like something was missing. Now it feels intentional. You don't fill every quiet moment with noise. You don't rush to schedule every empty hour. You begin using solitude to think clearly, to reset emotionally, to process experiences without outside influence. This doesn't mean you've become isolated. It means you've become self-sufficient. You've learned that constant company isn't the same as meaningful connection. And once you discover that solitude can be restorative instead of draining, your standards for connection naturally rise. You no longer tolerate relationships that leave you feeling emptier than being alone. That realization changes how you engage socially. You choose quality over quantity. You become slower to attach and quicker to step back from misalignment. And that shift alters your environment. The world feels quieter, not because it lost people, but because you stopped overextending yourself. When your inner dialogue becomes kinder, one of the most profound changes often goes unnoticed by others. It's the way you speak to yourself. Maybe you used to criticize every mistake, replay every awkward moment, question every decision. But growth softens that internal voice. You start offering yourself understanding instead of judgment. You acknowledge your effort instead of only your outcomes. You stop punishing yourself for not being perfect. This internal shift changes everything, because the way you treat yourself sets the baseline for how you tolerate being treated by others. When your self-talk becomes respectful, you become less tolerant of disrespect externally. When your inner voice becomes patient, you stop chasing environments that thrive on pressure and urgency. You realize that peace isn't something you find outside. It's something you cultivate inside. And once cultivated, you become protective of it. That protection isn't aggression. It's alignment. And alignment reshapes your world. When you start trusting your own timing, there was likely a phase when comparison drove you. You measured your progress against others. You worried about falling behind. You felt pressure to move faster, achieve more, prove yourself. Growth changes your relationship with timing. You begin understanding that everyone moves at a different pace. That forced acceleration often leads to burnout. That rushing can distort purpose. You stop reacting to external timelines. You start listening to your internal readiness. This shift reduces anxiety in ways that feel almost unfamiliar. You're no longer in constant competition. You're in conversation with yourself. And that calm approach makes environments built on urgency feel overwhelming. When others panic about being behind, you remain steady. When others chase every trend, you pause. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you intentional. And intention changes how your life unfolds. When you no longer need to win every interaction, there's a maturity that comes with realizing that not every disagreement requires victory. Earlier versions of you might have felt compelled to defend every point, to correct every inaccuracy, to prove your intelligence or your perspective. Now you evaluate differently. You ask yourself, is this worth my energy? Sometimes the answer is yes. Often it's no. You recognize that preserving peace can be more valuable than winning arguments. You understand that some people argue to understand, and others argue to dominate. And once you identify the difference, You stop engaging in battles that serve no purpose. That restraint can confuse people. They might interpret it as disinterest or weakness. But it's neither. It's discipline. You're choosing where to invest your voice. And that choice changes your experience of the world. Interactions become lighter, drama becomes rarer, emotional exhaustion decreases. Everything feels different because you're no longer fighting battles that don't align with who you're becoming. If something in this message felt familiar, don't brush it off. Take a moment and really think about where you've changed. What no longer feels the same? What conversations drain you now that used to excite you? What standards have quietly risen without you announcing them? Share your experience in the comments, not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, but to put language to your growth. When you articulate what's shifting inside you, it becomes more real, more grounded, more integrated. And if you're in that in-between phase where everything feels different but you can't fully explain why, stay connected here. This space is for real reflection, honest evolution, and conversations that go deeper than surface motivation. Subscribe if you value growth that's steady, self-aware, and rooted in reality. Your world feels different because you're seeing it differently. Let's keep evolving consciously.